March 19, 1945. The transport truck rumbled to a stop outside Camp Wheeler, Iowa, and Irmgard Lehman felt her stomach clench with familiar dread. Through the canvas opening, she could see wooden buildings arranged in neat rows, watchtowers standing sentinel against a pale Midwestern sky. This was enemy territory. This was where the Americans would exact their revenge on captured German soldiers, even if those soldiers happened to be women. Irmgard was 24 years old, though the past 3 years had aged her beyond her years. She had served in the Women's Auxiliary Corps as a radio operator, believing she was defending her homeland against aggressors who wanted to destroy everything she loved. Now, captured during the chaotic retreat through France and transported across an ocean to a country she had been taught to hate and fear, she prepared herself for the worst. Beside her sat Hedwig Krauss, called Hetty by those who knew her well. At 22, she had the kind of delicate features that made her look even younger, especially now with hollowed cheeks and dark circles beneath her eyes. Krista Steinbach, 26, and the eldest of their small group, maintained her rigid posture even as the truck doors opened. Lotta Bergman, barely 20, clutched a small cloth bag containing the few possessions she had managed to keep through capture and transport. They climbed down from the truck with as much dignity as exhaustion allowed. American soldiers watched them with expressions that Irmgard couldn't quite read. Not hatred, as she had expected. Not cruelty. Something closer to curiosity, perhaps even uncertainty about how to handle this unusual cargo of female enemy prisoners. Captain Harriet Caldwell stood waiting, a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore her uniform with the kind of authority that transcended gender, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the compound. You will be processed and assigned to barracks. You will follow camp regulations. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. She paused, studying the exhausted women before her. Dinner is served at 1800 hours in the mess hall. You are expected to attend. Dinner. The word seemed almost absurd to Irmgard. In Germany, dinner had long since become whatever scraps could be found or stretched into something resembling a meal. The rations for Auxiliary Corps members had been meager even before the final collapse, consisting mainly of dark bread, thin soup, and occasional potatoes. Real meat had disappeared from their tables 2 years ago. Butter had become a memory so distant it seemed like something from childhood fairy tales. The women were led to a barracks that shocked them with its cleanliness. Real beds with mattresses, not straw pallets. Blankets that looked thick and warm. A stove in the corner that suggested heat would be available when needed. Irmgard exchanged glances with Hetty, both women afraid to believe what they were seeing. This had to be temporary, a cruel trick before the real punishment began. No one treated enemy prisoners this well. The propaganda had been clear about American brutality and deprivation. Yet, as the afternoon faded and the dinner hour approached, no guards came to drag them away. No punishment materialized. Instead, Sergeant Vernon Shaw appeared at their door and simply said, "Mess hall is that building there. You should come now." Irmgard remembered the last time she had seen real butter. It was spring of 1942, 3 years before her capture, when her mother had used the final precious portion saved from their ration cards to make a small cake for Irmgard's younger sister Annalie's 16th birthday. The butter had been kept wrapped in damp cloth in the coolest corner of their cellar, hoarded over weeks of careful saving. Her mother had measured it out with trembling hands, knowing this might be the last time any of them would taste such a luxury. Even then, in 42, Germany had begun the slow descent into genuine hunger. The early war years had brought rationing, certainly, but the system had still functioned with some reliability. Families received their allotted portions of meat, eggs, milk, and fats according to carefully calculated schedules. The amounts were smaller than before the war, but people adapted. They learned to stretch ingredients, to make one chicken feed a family of 6, to add water to milk to make it last longer. But by 1943, the rationing system itself began to collapse under the weight of military demands and Allied bombing of transportation networks. Irmgard had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps that year, motivated partly by patriotic duty, but also by the practical promise of regular meals for Corps members. Her family could manage better with one less mouth to feed, and she could send portions of her rations home when possible. The reality of Auxiliary Corps' rations proved grimmer than the recruitment promises suggested. Breakfast consisted of ersatz coffee made from roasted barley and chicory root, accompanied by a slice of dark bread so heavy with sawdust filler that it sat in the stomach like a stone. The bread was sometimes spread with a substance called butter that bore no resemblance to the real thing. This wartime margarine was manufactured from coal tar derivatives, colored yellow with dye, and possessed a chemical taste that made eating it an act of will rather than pleasure. Lunch brought thin soup, usually made from turnips or potatoes, occasionally enhanced with a few scraps of vegetables or a bare hint of meat fat. Irmgard learned to eat slowly, to make each spoonful last, to trick her stomach into feeling more satisfied than the meager portions warranted. She learned to ignore the constant gnawing sensation that became as familiar as breathing. Dinner offered more of the same dark bread, sometimes, with a small portion of cheese that was more filler than dairy, or a serving of boiled potatoes when they were available. On rare occasions, perhaps once every few weeks, they received a thin slice of sausage that was more grain and mystery ingredients than actual meat. The women in her unit learned to supplement official rations however they could. They foraged for wild greens in spring, gathered acorns to grind into flour substitutes, traded favors and possessions for extra food. Irmgard had bartered her only pair of civilian shoes for 2 eggs and a small jar of real honey from a farmer near their posting. She had eaten 1 egg immediately, savoring every bite, and sent the other home to her sister along with half the honey. By 1944, even these inadequate rations became irregular. Supply lines disrupted by bombing meant days would pass with nothing but stale bread and water, flavored with a few grains of the hated ersatz coffee. Irmgard's uniform hung loose on her frame. Her cheekbones became prominent, her wrists thin enough that her watch slipped down her arm. November 1944. The chaos of the German retreat through France remained vivid in Irmgard's memory even months later. Allied forces had advanced with devastating speed, cutting through defensive positions that commanders had promised would hold for weeks. Irmgard's communications unit had been stationed in a commandeered farmhouse outside Metz, maintaining radio contact with scattered Wehrmacht units as the front collapsed around them. The order to evacuate came too late. American forces had already encircled their position, cutting off the escape route to the east. Irmgard remembered the strange silence that fell over their unit when they realized there was nowhere left to run. Her commanding officer, a weary captain named Dietrich, who had lost his enthusiasm for the war somewhere in the Russian winter of '42, had simply set down his pistol and walked out with his hands raised. The American soldiers who took them prisoner were younger than Irmgard had expected, many looking barely old enough to shave. They searched the women for weapons with professional efficiency, but without the brutality propaganda had promised. One soldier, noticing Hetty shivering in the November cold, had draped his own jacket over her shoulders. The gesture had confused her so completely that she stood frozen, unable to comprehend why an enemy would show such consideration. They were processed through a series of temporary camps in France, each move bringing them farther from home and deeper into uncertainty. The propaganda they had absorbed for years painted vivid pictures of American cruelty, of prisoners worked to death or simply shot. Yet each camp contradicted these expectations. They received medical examinations. Their worn shoes were replaced with sturdy boots. They were deloused and given clean clothes, not their auxiliary uniforms, but simple dresses that hung loose on their undernourished frames. The ocean crossing in January of 45 had been Irmgard's first time on a ship. The converted transport vessel carried hundreds of prisoners in cramped conditions below deck. But even there, the treatment defied everything they had been taught to expect. They received 2 meals daily, simple but more substantial than what they had eaten in Germany. The bread was white, made from real wheat flour without sawdust filler. There was soup with actual vegetables floating in the broth, not just colored water with a few turnip scraps. Lotta had cried the first time she tasted the ship's bread, overwhelmed by the realization that their own government had been feeding them worse than the Americans fed their prisoners. Krista had told her sharply to stop crying, that showing weakness would only encourage their captors. But Irmgard had seen tears in Krista's eyes too. From New York, they traveled by train across American vastness. The journey took 3 days, and Irmgard spent hours watching the landscape pass. Farmland stretched for miles without visible bomb damage. Towns showed no signs of the destruction that had become normal in Germany. Factories operated with lights blazing even at night, unconcerned about air raids. The disconnect between what she was seeing and what she had been told about American weakness left her struggling to reconcile 2 incompatible realities. Morning arrived at Camp Wheeler with a clarity that seemed uniquely American. The Iowa sky stretched endless and blue, unmarred by the smoke and haze that had hung perpetually over German cities for the past 2 years. Irmgard woke to the sound of a bell ringing across the compound, signaling breakfast. She had barely slept, her mind too restless with uncertainty about what this first full day in the camp would bring. The 4 women dressed in silence, each lost in her own thoughts. They had been given simple cotton dresses the day before, plain and practical, but clean and whole, without the patches and repairs that had characterized their clothing for years. Even these basic garments felt like luxury against skin accustomed to coarse, worn fabric. Sergeant Vernon Shaw appeared at their barracks door precisely at 0700 hours. He was a man in his 50s, too old for combat duty, with a weathered face that suggested years of farming before the war. His expression was neutral, professional, revealing nothing of what he thought about guarding German women. "Breakfast," he said simply, gesturing toward the mess hall. "Follow me." They walked across the compound in a tight group, drawing curious stares from other personnel. The mess hall was a long wooden building, larger than Irmgard had expected. Through the windows, she could see rows of tables already filling with people. The smell that drifted out made her stomach clench with sudden, painful hunger. It was the smell of real food, of cooking, that involved more than boiling turnips in water. Inside, Corporal Russell Kovrick stood near the serving line, a clipboard in hand. He was younger than Shaw, perhaps 30, with the build of someone who had done physical labor all his life. When he saw the German women enter, he nodded once and gestured toward an empty table near the back. "Sit there," he said. "Someone will bring your trays." The table was clean, the benches sturdy. But what caught Irmgard's attention, what made her breath catch in her throat, were the small dishes already placed at each setting. In each dish sat a pale yellow square, perhaps 2 inches across. The morning light from the windows caught it, making it gleam softly. Butter. Real butter. Irmgard stared at it, unable to process what she was seeing. Beside her, Hetty had gone completely still. Krista leaned forward slightly, as if confirming with closer inspection that her eyes weren't deceiving her. Lotta reached out one trembling finger, then pulled it back, afraid to touch something that couldn't possibly be real. Private Mildred Callahan approached their table carrying a tray laden with plates. She was a sturdy woman in her mid-20s, with red hair pulled back under her cap and freckles across her nose. She set down plates in front of each woman, and what Irmgard saw on those plates made the butter seem almost reasonable by comparison. 2 eggs, their yolks golden and intact. 3 strips of bacon, actual meat, glistening with fat. A thick slice of white bread still warm, a cup of coffee that smelled like real coffee beans, not the hated ersatz substitute. And in the center of the table, a larger dish containing more butter, much more. For a long moment, none of the four women moved. They sat frozen before their plates, staring at food that seemed to belong to a dream or a memory from before the war. Around them, American soldiers and staff ate their own breakfasts with casual indifference, treating this abundance as nothing more than ordinary routine. Irmgard watched a young soldier at the next table spread butter thickly on his bread, take 2 bites, and leave the rest on his plate as he stood to leave. The waste of it made something twist painfully in her chest. That discarded bread with its generous smear of butter represented more fat than she had consumed in a month back in Germany. Hetty was the first to break. Her hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching for the small dish of butter in front of her. She picked up her spoon, and instead of reaching for the bread, she dipped the spoon directly into the butter. A generous portion came up, and before anyone could speak or stop her, she put the entire spoonful into her mouth. Her eyes closed. Tears began streaming down her face as she swallowed. Her hand was already moving again, scooping another spoonful and another. She ate the butter like it was soup, like it was the only thing in the world that mattered, like she could somehow consume enough now to make up for 3 years of deprivation. Lotta followed next, her movements less frantic but equally desperate. She spread butter on her bread, but the layer she applied was easily 1/2 inch thick, more butter than bread visible beneath it. She bit into it and made a sound that was half sob, half moan of pure relief. Krista, who had always maintained the strictest discipline, who had never shown weakness even during the worst days of their service, picked up her butter dish and simply tilted it to her mouth. The soft yellow mass slid onto her tongue, and she sat there with tears running silently down her face, the empty dish still held to her lips. Irmgard felt her own hands shaking as she reached for her butter. She tried to maintain some dignity, tried to spread it on her bread like a civilized person, but her control shattered halfway through. She abandoned the bread and ate directly from the dish, the rich, creamy taste exploding across her tongue after years of rancid margarine and hunger. The American personnel had stopped eating. Private Mildred Callahan stood motionless near the serving line, her expression shifting from confusion to something like horror as she began to understand what she was witnessing. This wasn't misbehavior or lack of manners. This was starvation, revealing itself in the presence of plenty. Corporal Kovaric set down his clipboard slowly. Sergeant Shaw, who had seen combat in the First War and thought nothing could surprise him anymore, found himself unable to look away from these 4 women eating butter like their lives depended on it. Because once, not so long ago, their lives had depended on anything they could find to eat. And butter had been gone so long it had become mythical. The realization of what they had done crashed over Irmgard like cold water. She set down her empty butter dish and looked at her companions, seeing her own horror reflected in their faces. Hetty had butter smeared at the corner of her mouth. Lotta's fingers were slick with it. Krista sat rigid, staring at the empty dish in her hands as if it belonged to someone else. Around them, the mess hall had fallen into an uncomfortable silence. American soldiers watched with expressions ranging from shock to pity to something that might have been disgust. Irmgard felt heat rising in her face, shame burning through her like fever. They had behaved like animals, like creatures without any self-control or dignity. Everything the propaganda had said about German superiority and discipline had just been demolished by their desperate consumption of butter. She waited for the punishment to begin, for Sergeant Shaw to order them to stand, to march them back to their barracks, to reduce their rations as penalty for this grotesque display. In the Auxiliary Corps, such loss of discipline would have meant written reprimands at minimum, possibly more severe consequences. But Shaw simply stood near the door, his weathered face unreadable. Corporal Kovaric had picked up his clipboard again, but wasn't writing anything, just holding it like he needed something to do with his hands. Private Callahan had turned away, but not before Irmgard saw something glistening in the younger woman's eyes. "Finish your breakfast," Shaw said finally, his voice gruff. "All of it. That's an order." Irmgard looked down at her plate. The eggs had gone cold, the bacon congealing in its own fat. Her stomach, shocked by the sudden influx of pure fat after years of near starvation, churned uncomfortably. But an order was an order, and obeying orders was something she understood. She picked up her fork and began to eat, forcing down food her body desperately needed, but could barely process. The other women did the same. They ate in silence, unable to meet each other's eyes or the eyes of anyone else in the mess hall. The eggs tasted like ambrosia despite being cold. The bacon was salty and rich beyond anything Irmgard remembered. Even the bread, plain white bread, without the butter they had already devoured, seemed impossibly luxurious. When they finally finished, they sat waiting for instructions, for judgment, for whatever consequences would follow their shameful behavior. But Shaw just nodded toward the door. "Back to your barracks. Work assignments will be posted after lunch." They filed out of the mess hall with their heads down, unable to look at the Americans they passed. Irmgard felt the weight of their stares, imagined the contempt they must feel for these pathetic German women who had eaten butter by the spoonful like starving dogs. Back in their barracks, the four of them sat on their bunks without speaking. The silence stretched on, heavy with mortification and the uncomfortable fullness of their stomachs, trying to adjust to real food. Outside, the Iowa morning continued its cheerful brightness, indifferent to their shame. None of them could have predicted what would happen at lunch. That afternoon, Captain Harriet Caldwell distributed writing paper and pencils to the women's barracks. It was standard procedure, she explained in her clipped, efficient manner. Prisoners were permitted to write letters home, though all correspondence would be reviewed by military censors, and delivery could not be guaranteed given the current state of affairs in occupied Germany. Irmgard sat on her bunk with the blank paper before her, the pencil feeling strange in her hand after months without writing anything personal. She thought of her sister, Annalie, now 19 years old, if she was still alive. Their last communication had been in August of '44, a brief letter that had taken 6 weeks to arrive, already outdated by the time Irmgard received it. Annalie had written about working in a munitions factory, about the nightly air raids, about Mother's persistent cough that wouldn't go away. Where was Annalie now? Was she alive? Was their mother? Hamburg had been bombed repeatedly. Their neighborhood might not even exist anymore. The apartment where Irmgard had grown up, where she had last seen real butter on Annalie's birthday cake in '42, might be nothing but rubble. But she began writing anyway, because the need to tell someone about what she had experienced was overwhelming. "Dear Annalie," she wrote in German, her handwriting cramped from disuse, "I do not know if this letter will ever reach you, or if you are still there to receive it. I do not even know if I should tell you what I am about to write, because you will think I have lost my mind or that I am lying. But I must tell someone, and you are the only person I can imagine understanding." She paused, trying to find words for something that still seemed impossible, even having lived through it. "This morning, the Americans gave us butter, real butter, Annalie. Not the coal tar margarine we learned to choke down, but actual butter made from cream. They gave each of us our own portion, and there was more on the table, as much as we wanted. I ate mine with a spoon, directly from the dish, like a mad woman. I could not stop myself. Hetty and Krista and Lotta did the same. We must have looked like animals to them." Her hand trembled as she continued writing. "But that is not the strangest part. The strangest part is that they also gave us eggs. 2 eggs each, not watered down or stretched or saved for special occasions, just 2 eggs as if this were normal. And bacon, real meat, thick with fat. And bread made from white flour without any sawdust or substitute grains. And coffee that smells like coffee." She stopped, reading back what she had written. It sounded insane. It sounded like propaganda, like the exaggerated stories they had been told about enemy decadence and waste, while Germans suffered nobly. "I know you will not believe me," she wrote. "I am not certain I believe it myself. How can our enemies have so much when we had so little? What were we told about their starvation and weakness? What else were we told that was not true?" The butter appeared again at dinner, and again at breakfast the next morning, and the morning after that. It became clear this was not some temporary aberration or psychological trick meant to soften them before harsher treatment began. This abundance was simply normal life in America, even in a prisoner of war camp, even during wartime. By the end of their first week at Camp Wheeler, the four women had begun to confront an uncomfortable truth. Everything they had been told about America was a lie, not an exaggeration or a hopeful misrepresentation, but a complete fabrication designed to keep them fighting for a cause that had already lost. The propaganda had painted vivid pictures of American suffering. They had been told that the United States was on the brink of collapse, that its people were starving, while resources were wasted on a war that did not concern them. They had been shown photographs, supposedly from American cities, of bread lines and desperate crowds. They had been assured that German discipline and efficiency would inevitably triumph over American chaos and weakness. But here was the reality. Even prisoners, enemy prisoners who had fought against this country, received more food in a single day than Auxiliary Corps members in Germany had seen in a week. The casual abundance was almost obscene. Soldiers left food on their plates. The kitchen staff threw away scraps that would have fed a German family for days. Butter was served at every meal, as if it were nothing more remarkable than water. Irmgard watched Private Mildred Callahan during meals, studying how the young American woman moved through the mess hall with easy confidence, refilling coffee cups and replacing empty butter dishes without any sense that she was distributing precious resources. To Callahan, butter was just butter, plentiful and unremarkable. One afternoon during their second week, Captain Caldwell called the German women to her office. They filed in nervously, still expecting punishment or harsh treatment despite all evidence to the contrary. Caldwell gestured for them to sit, then regarded them with an expression that was difficult to interpret. "I have been observing your reactions during meals," she said, her voice measured. "I have been informed about the incident on your first morning here." She paused, and Irmgard felt shame flooding back, hot and overwhelming. "I want you to understand something. What you experienced that morning was not a failure of discipline on your part. It was a failure of your government to care for its own people." The words hung in the air. No one had ever spoken to them this way before, addressing directly the cognitive dissonance they had been struggling with since their capture. "The United States is not perfect," Caldwell continued. "We have our own problems, our own failures, but we do not starve our soldiers. We do not lie to our people about the basic realities of the war, and we do not treat prisoners the way you were led to believe you would be treated." She opened a drawer and pulled out a newspaper, sliding it across the desk toward them. The headline was in German, printed by Allied Information Services for distribution in occupied territories. Spring arrived in Iowa with a gentleness that seemed impossible to women accustomed to the harsh transitions of northern Germany. The snow melted gradually, revealing rich black soil beneath. Trees budded with a patient confidence that spoke of seasons cycling reliably, year after year, undisturbed by war. By April, the camp had settled into routines that felt less like imprisonment and more like an unexpected sanctuary. The work assignments kept the women occupied. Irmgard had been assigned to assist in the administrative office, her careful handwriting and growing English skills making her useful for filing and basic correspondence. Hetty worked in the laundry, Krista in the supply depot, and Lotta in the camp infirmary, where her gentle manner with patients proved valuable. But it was in the kitchen where the most significant transformation occurred. Private Mildred Callahan had approached Captain Caldwell with an unusual request. She wanted to learn German cooking, she explained, and thought perhaps the prisoners might be willing to teach her in exchange for learning more American recipes. Caldwell, recognizing an opportunity for positive engagement, approved the arrangement. The first lesson took place on a Saturday afternoon in late April. Irmgard, Hetty, Krista, and Lotta gathered in the kitchen with Callahan and Corporal Kovaric, who had expressed interest in anything involving food. The atmosphere was awkward at first, both groups uncertain how to navigate this voluntary interaction that fell outside the normal bounds of captor and prisoner. "I thought maybe you could show us how to make something from home," Callahan said, her hands fidgeting with her apron. "Something you miss." Krista, who had worked in her family's bakery before the war, suggested Apfelkuchen, apple cake. But then she stopped, her face falling. "We would need butter," she said quietly. "A great deal of butter, and real eggs, and cream. We have not been able to make proper Apfelkuchen since 1941. "We have all of that," Kovaric said, already moving toward the storage room. "How much do you need?" What followed was an afternoon that none of them would forget. Krista's hands, accustomed to working with substitutes and making do with inadequate ingredients, trembled as she measured out real butter, abundant and golden. She cracked eggs without having to stretch them with water or flour. She poured actual cream without calculating how to make a cup serve the purpose of a quart. The other women gathered around, offering suggestions in German that Callahan and Kovaric couldn't understand but tried to follow through gestures and tone. When flour dusted across the counter, Lotta began laughing, a sound so unexpected that everyone stopped to stare. It was the first time any of them had heard her laugh since their capture. "I'm sorry," Lotta said, still giggling. "It is just, we have flour everywhere and no one is angry. No one is worried about waste. In Germany, this much spilled flour would have been a crisis." The Apfelkuchen emerged from the oven an hour later, its aroma filling the kitchen with the scent of cinnamon, apples, and butter-rich cake. Krista cut generous slices, and they all sat together around the work table to taste it. 20 years later, 1965. Irmgard Lehman stood in her bakery on Locust Street in Des Moines, Iowa, watching the morning sun illuminate the display cases filled with fresh pastries. The small bell above the door chimed, announcing the arrival of her first customers, a group of Vietnamese refugees recently resettled in the city through a church sponsorship program. They entered hesitantly, their clothes donated and ill-fitting, their faces carrying the unmistakable expression of people displaced by war and uncertain of their welcome. Irmgard recognized that expression immediately. She had worn it herself 2 decades earlier, standing in an Iowa prisoner of war camp and trying to understand how enemy territory could feel safer than home. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to the small tables near the window. Her English carried only the faintest trace of accent now, softened by 20 years of American life. "I have something for you." She brought out a tray of fresh pastries, still warm from the oven. Apple cake made with real butter, the recipe Krista had taught her on that spring afternoon in Camp Wheeler. Beside each pastry, she placed a small dish containing a pat of butter, golden and perfect. The refugees stared at the food with the same disbelieving expression Irmgard remembered from her own first morning in the mess hall. One woman, perhaps in her 30s, reached out tentatively and touched the butter as if confirming it was real. "It is yours," Irmgard said gently. "All of it. There is more if you want more." She watched them eat, saw the careful way they rationed each bite at first, then the gradual relaxation as they began to trust that this abundance was not a trick. The older woman spread butter thickly on her pastry, and Irmgard saw tears tracking down her face as she ate. After they finished, after Irmgard had sent them home with bags of bread and pastries, she returned to her kitchen. On a shelf above her workspace sat a small butter dish, ceramic and plain, with a tiny crack along one edge. She had carried it with her from Camp Wheeler when she left to start her new life, one of the few possessions she had kept from those transformative months. She picked it up now, running her finger along the familiar crack. This dish had sat on the table during her first American breakfast, had held the butter that revealed to her how completely she had been lied to about her enemies. It had been present during those Saturday afternoon cooking lessons when former enemies became something closer to friends. It had witnessed her transformation from prisoner to immigrant, from enemy to citizen. Captain Harriet Caldwell had given it to her as a parting gift. "Remember where you came from," Caldwell had said, "but more importantly, remember that people can change, that kindness matters, that the smallest gestures can reveal the deepest truths." Irmgard set the dish back on its shelf and returned to her work. Outside, Des Moines continued its ordinary Thursday morning routines. Inside her bakery, the scent of butter and fresh bread created a sanctuary where the displaced and hungry would always find welcome.